With no further ado, it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our colleague, Professor Anne Mathers from the University of Reading, and who's going to talk to us under this enigmatic and wonderfully mellifluous title, Spheres, Rays and Superluminary Airs.
Thank you. I should start by saying, well, first of all, thank you very much to the organisers for the invitation to speak. I should also explain that I am not a scientist, I am one of the medieval humanities specialists, and my particular interest is in what might loosely be called the meeting point between science and what was considered to be magic in the medieval period. And I am particularly here this afternoon to talk about part of a research project which I've been working on for a couple of years now, which has to do with the understanding of weather and the extent to which changes in the weather in the future could be predicted as understood in the medieval period. And that's why I went for this very grand but very vague title, because weather brought together all sorts of problems which were both theologically and practically and scientifically difficult in the society which we are focusing on. And it is also something on which Grosseteste himself made a very important and distinctive intervention. So why was weather a problem for medieval thinkers? Because it raised all sorts of problems about the relationship, first of all, between God and the natural and human world. It was clear from the reading of the Bible that God used extreme weather events both to send messages to human society and to reward or to punish. And that the interpretation of weather events and the interpretation of God's warnings of future weather events was a very important matter in the Bible. If you think of examples of prophets from the Old Testament, the kings are given warnings about forthcoming events through dreams, which then have to be interpreted by a true prophet before their correct meaning can be understood. Then, once Joseph has made his interpretation, Pharaoh knows to allow for the coming years of famine, and society can be saved, and so on. So in the early Middle Ages, I am summarising wildly, so feel free to ask questions at the end, but in the early medieval period, it was assumed that weather was something that humans were simply given. God sends it. Extreme weather is also sent by God. And to all intents and purposes, it is beyond human understanding. Now then comes, again simplifying wildly, the 12th century and the arrival of Greek and Arabic science. And the sudden revelation that it is possible to see weather in a completely different way. This is to show you the impact of the new science. I'm sorry that this is not clear, but by the 13th century, an enormous amount of new data about planetary positions, the positions of stars and star formations, and how these movements of the heavens related to events on Earth had become available. So suddenly weather is not a means of communication between God and human society, but a predictable part, or a potentially predictable part, of the natural world. And weather becomes a function of time and place, which is what makes it relevant for this afternoon's session on time and its calculation. What I mean by that is that in the new understanding of the world, weather ought simply to be produced by your place on the globe, and therefore the climatic zone in which you live, and the time of year which dominates or produces the relationship between the sun and the moon, the two key planets, and your particular place. So this ought to be a simple, predictable matter. And yet, extreme weather events can happen in almost any time of year, in almost any point on the globe. And equally, even if you take just one place and focus, say, on 1 month, you will find that the weather in that place in that month varies year by year. So what is going on? And how predictable is it? And when does unpredictable weather become a sign from God? This is a problem for theologians, it's a problem for historians, for chroniclers, who have to decide how to record a weather event. At what point a weather event becomes extreme enough to be written down in their chronicle as something of major significance. And interpretation is still seen as a matter for the inspired. It verges almost on prophecy. Now we come to the 13th century, and the further layer of complication, which this slide, and particularly the upper image of this in this slide, is meant to represent. Because the idea of the machina mundi, or the world machine, becomes even more sophisticated and apparently even more predictable. If weather is a function of the movements of the sun, the movements of the moon, and the movements of the other planets within the complex set of rings which make up the machine of the universe, why is weather still so variable? Well, the increasing answer was because it's not a simple matter. Weather is the result of the interactions of all of these planets. And the more that was understood about the orbits of the planets and the complexity of the orbits of the planets as they move around their sphere, so it was understood that the same point on the globe at the same time in any year can be underneath a different interacting set of planets. And this made a beautifully logical explanation for changes in weather year on year. Now, if that was accepted, and it was, the next question is, well, does this mean that weather is simply predictable? If we can figure out the exact configuration of planets in relation to a particular point on the globe on any date we want, can we deduce from that exactly what the weather will be? Or is this, in effect, trespassing into the forbidden territory of what was called judicial astrology, which had been roundly condemned by Augustine back in the 5th century, and which all theologians routinely condemned? The problem with judicial astrology is that it makes predictions about human beings. And as Augustine had already pointed out, and as all theologians repeated after him, to say that the planets can predict what a human being will do is seriously to trespass on that human being's free will. And if you take away free will, you take away moral responsibility, and almost the whole of Christian theology and moral thinking comes crashing down. So judicial astrology is completely flying in the face of acceptable doctrine. So it seems simple. Judicial astrology is out because it predicts actions that human beings supposedly will make in the future, or things that will happen to human beings in the future. But reading the natural universe, reading the natural world, is merely science. It's not judicial astrology at all, it's just making a scientific prediction. Now this is where our next problem comes in. Grosseteste himself was perfectly happy about that distinction. But the next problem is, was it possible for astronomers and astrologers in this period to calculate the coming positions of the planets with sufficient accuracy? And that's partly what's going on in this image, because one of the complications precisely had to do with the three-dimensional relationships between the movements and positions of the planets, and the degree of complexity with which an astronomer or an astrologer was trying to predict the positions of those planets. And one reason why I chose this image, which is from a manuscript which contains works by Grosseteste but does not depict, I have to confess, Grosseteste himself, is the philosopher at the top, the large brown-looking object which the figure at the top is holding, is an armillary sphere, within which you have a simplified three-dimensional model of the orbits around which the planets move. Down at the bottom, you have a two-dimensional representation of the concentric spheres, which delimit the zones within which the orbit of each planet is set, and the outer zone of the fixed stars, which effectively controls them all, and within which the belt of the zodiac and the signs of the zodiac, which is going to be very important for all of this, is set. Already, though, you see that in order to understand the actual layout of the spheres, we have to move to a two-dimensional diagram and away from three dimensions. And this is part of the problem that Grosseteste himself identified. So if I come on to him, one of the problems with Grosseteste is, did he distinguish between astrology and astronomy? Where did he think the boundary between the acceptable and the unacceptable was? And what has weather forecasting got to do with all of this? Well, it is said often that Grosseteste, early in his writing career, was interested in astrology. And part of the evidence for this comes from a manuscript in the Bodleian Library, which is now Saville 21, which contains what are usually called astrological diagrams. But they are simply diagrams of two conjunctions, two planetary conjunctions, which took place in the year 1215 to 16. Now, the manuscript itself contains a lot of mathematical information. It also contains tables for a Latin person who wants to try to understand the Arabic calendar. And it contains data on making calculations. Why is the Arabic calendar important for someone who wants to make a reading of where the planets are? Because the tables, which gave basic positions for the planets, from which all of your calculations are going to be made, were originally produced, well, in the version that comes into Latin and into Western Europe, were produced according to an Arabic calendar. And if you want to try to use them accurately, you therefore have to deal with the Arabic calendar as well as with all of the other problems. Why is this relevant? Because Grosseteste annotated the two diagrams of conjunctions, or it is said that this is his handwriting. And if it is, I have to tell you that in 1215 to 16, Grosseteste was not very expert at understanding the Arabic calendar, and also there is something severely wrong with the calculations involved, because the two conjunctions both involve the planet Saturn. They're in 2 consecutive months, probably in the same year, though the annotation is awkward and it's not clear. And they have the planet Saturn at a distance apart of only 1 month in 2 different signs of the zodiac. And that is not possible at the points of the zodiac given in these calculations, because Saturn moves far too slowly. So something has gone horribly wrong for whoever made those calculations. Now, if we skip forward to Grosseteste's commentary on the Hexameron, the days of creation, and the section where he's talking about the creation of the planets and what it is legitimate and illegitimate to read from the planets, you find that he goes out of his way to say that weather forecasting from the planets is fine, but that judicial astrology is wrong. He repeats Augustine's arguments as to why judicial astrology is wrong, and then comes an outburst in which he says, and anyway, the astronomers just cannot do it. They cannot know exactly where the planets are going to be. They need to know the positions, they need to know the qualities of the signs, they need to know the powers of the planets, they need to know the risings, they need to know the aspects, they need to know the divisions of the signs. It just is not possible. And therefore, the whole thing is rubbish, because the astronomers just cannot make these predictions effectively. And this is known to anyone who has worked hard on the tables and on the Arabic calendar. So I don't think this is a condemnation of all uses of astronomy or astrology to predict the future at all. I think it has to do in relation to the weather with the sheer practical difficulty of it. And that's what makes what may be the late treatise, which I have recently been working on, so interesting. So this is simply from a published version of a different text, but it's by evidence that certainly by the time that the treatise on the impressions of the air, and therefore on weather forecasting, was written, Grosseteste had been doing a lot of work on planetary tables and on spherical geometry. And I am now much happier than I used to be about the idea that this treatise was actually written in the 1240s, and that Grosseteste therefore has come back to weather forecasting, now not only believing that it is potentially possible, but actually arguing that it is genuinely, practically possible. The treatise is in 3 parts. The first part is effectively a simplification and abbreviation of Book 1 of Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos. So we're taken at rapid speed and in simplified version through the planets, the signs, the combination of qualities of each planet and each sign, and the element to which each sign relates. He then introduces the technical term triplicity, then takes you through very briefly the portions of life on Earth to which each planet is particularly attuned, and then comes up with what seems to be entirely his own system. He takes from Ptolemy the idea that the planets are particularly powerful when they are in harmony with one another, and therefore in certain designated aspects in relation to one another. And he actually quantifies these. He arranges them. One is 5 times more powerful than the least, one is 4, 3, 2, and so on. I won't take you through all the detailed terminology because you would fall asleep. But this has been seen by historians as very reductive and mechanistic, and as Grosseteste oversimplifying to an almost comic level. That is unfair. For a start, because he introduces at this point the idea that you are looking to find which planet has the most power at any particular point. Because that one, he says, is going to be the dispositor ilios temporis, so the lord of the hour or of the time. And what he's given you is a mathematical, scientific way of making that calculation. The middle point of the treatise then goes into the spherical geometry, which is illustrated by this image. Because here Grosseteste has yet another completely individual and unique argument to make, and almost going against the system set out in Ptolemy's Almagest, which I think possibly he didn't know when he was writing this treatise. Because he wants to argue that the planet, any planet, is particularly powerful when it's at the apogee, or O, of its orbit, and less powerful when it is at the lower point, or perigee, of its orbit. And he has a scientific proof for this. Simplifying radically, what he says is that a planet at the furthest point of its orbit will be moving on a circle whose radius is considerably greater than the equivalent circle whose radius is the smaller part of the diameter of the eccentric circle overall. That probably doesn't make much sense, but effectively the planet has got to travel further around the sky when at O than when at opposite O. His next step is to point out that the revolutions of the firmament, which are governing all of this, are constant and take place at the same speed every day. And the length of time during which the planet is at apogee or perigee will be the same. Therefore, if the planet has got to cover more distance in the same time, it must necessarily be moving faster, and hence it will be more powerful. Now, he takes you through some incredibly complicated spherical geometry to prove this, which I cannot follow. All I can say is that his references to Theodosius' spherics are accurate, and insofar as I can follow the arguments, he does seem to know what he is talking about. So he has now made 2 completely original interventions into the science of the planets, all in the course of predicting the weather. And the final part of the treatise is to make predictions for the year 1249. The first of them for April 1249, which identifies the sun as the dispositor of the time, or lord of the time, and explains why the contrary positions of Venus and the moon are not to be seen as too negative. And this is followed by a little note that says, and so it turned out. Then he goes on to another forecast, this one for July 1249, which is not followed by any such note. Now, if the note is part of a working version of this text, that dates these predictions to the middle of 1249 pretty precisely. Is it correct? Well, I don't know. The thing survives in only about 7 copies, and none of them are contemporary with Grosseteste. So I cannot prove that this is datable to 1249, but I would like to conclude really by just pointing out how original this was, and that Grosseteste is bringing science as he understands it, the science of time, the science of the machina mundi, the science of the geometry of how spheres work, together to demystify weather forecasting. Now you can do it with this handy guide, and you do not need to be a prophet. And he even concludes by telling you how to predict extreme weather events. Do you want to know when there will be a deluge? You can find out. Do you want to know when there will be terrible heat and drought? You can find out. And the power is now in your hands.